Montana Territory, 1900. The old man rocked gently on the porch of the weathered cabin, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the Montana plains stretched endlessly toward the Big Belt Mountains. The leather of the chair creaked beneath him, a sound as familiar as his own heartbeat after 30 years of sitting in this same spot. His hands, gnarled like the roots of an ancient oak, rested on his lap while his grandson sat at his feet, eyes wide with anticipation. "Tell me again, Grandpa," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the story itself required reverence. "About the winter you found her." Thomas Reeves smiled down at his grandson, 10 years old and already showing the same stubborn resolve Thomas had seen in himself at that age, and in her. "The winter of 1870, he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades, was the harshest winter the Montana Territory had ever known." The boy pulled his knees to his chest, settling in for a tale he'd requested countless times but never tired of hearing. The temperature that February dropped to 15 below zero, so cold that when you spat, it froze before it hit the ground. Thomas chuckled at the memory. "We didn't have fancy thermometers like we do now. We measured cold by how long it took frostbite to set in. That winter, it was minutes, not hours." He leaned back, and in his mind, 30 years melted away. He was no longer a 70-year-old man with a lifetime of memories etched into his face, but a man of 40, alone and broken in ways that went beyond flesh and bone. "I was younger then, about the age your father is now. My beard had just started showing gray, especially after losing your Aunt Catherine." The boy nodded solemnly. He knew about Catherine, though he'd never met her. Her portrait hung in the main house, forever 11 years old, with eyes that seemed to follow you around the room. "I was checking the fence line as the sun was going down," Thomas continued. "Back then we used split-rail fences, oak mostly. Had to check them daily in winter. The freeze and thaw would work them loose, and the cattle would find every weak spot." He closed his eyes, letting the memory take him fully. "That's when I heard it." February 12, 1870. The wind cut through Thomas Reeves' coat like it had teeth, biting at his flesh with Arctic ferocity. His breath clouded before him, crystallizing in his beard as he worked to secure a loose fence post. The temperature had been dropping steadily since noon, and now, with the sun disappearing behind the mountains, it was turning deadly. His fingers, protected only by worn leather gloves, had long since lost feeling. Each swing of the hammer sent jolts of pain up his arms as frozen muscles protested the movement. But the work needed finishing. A broken fence meant lost cattle, and lost cattle meant starvation before spring. Thomas paused, the hammer suspended mid-swing. Something had caught his attention above the moan of the wind, a sound that didn't belong to the winter chorus of creaking trees and distant wolf calls. He waited, ears straining. There it came again, a thin, reedy sound, almost like a coyote's whimper, but not quite. It carried something distinctly human in its pain. Thomas dropped the hammer into the snow and turned toward the sound. That's when he saw it, a trail of crimson droplets, shockingly vivid against the pristine white, leading from the tree line about 50 yards away. Something was dragging itself toward his property, leaving a wavering path of blood in its wake. At first, he thought it might be a wounded deer, perhaps shot by a hunter and escaped to die alone in the cold. But as he trudged through the knee-deep snow, following the trail back toward its source, he saw it was much smaller. A child, a small figure in a torn coat, crawled through the snow, one arm extended forward, then the other, pulling along something wrapped in oilskin. From this distance, he couldn't tell if it was a boy or girl, only that it was young and in grave trouble. "Hello there," he called, quickening his pace. The figure didn't respond, just continued its agonizing progress, inch by painful inch. When Thomas reached the child, he knelt in the snow. It was a girl, maybe 10 or 11, with tangled dark hair frozen in clumps around a face so pale it nearly matched the snow. Her lips were blue, her eyes unfocused, and she clutched the oilskin package with fingers locked in a death grip. "Can you hear me?" he asked, pulling off his scarf to wrap around her neck. Hypothermia, his mind registered clinically. Final stages. The girl's eyes flickered to his face. Recognition that he was human seemed to register, but little else. "Without the paper, am I real, mister?" she whispered, her voice cracked and faint. Thomas didn't understand the question, but he knew she wouldn't survive another 5 minutes in this cold. He gathered her into his arms, feeling how little she weighed even in her sodden clothes. That's when he saw it. As her coat shifted, he caught a glimpse of her shoulder blade. Burned into the flesh was the letter D, about 3 inches high, the skin around it angry and blistered despite the cold. The mark was fresh, maybe 2 or 3 days old, the same mark Gerald Donovan used on his cattle. Thomas felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. Not fear, but a familiar rage he hadn't felt since the war. The kind of righteous anger that had carried him through Gettysburg when men all around him were falling. "I've got you, Benau," he said, though he wasn't sure she could hear him anymore. "You're safe." He turned toward his cabin, the girl cradled against his chest. As he did, he spotted a flicker of light through the trees, maybe half a mile back, a lantern bobbing through the darkness. Someone was coming, someone looking for her. Thomas quickened his pace, the girl's weight nothing compared to the urgency he felt. The cabin was only 200 yards away now, its windows dark. No wife waiting with dinner on the table, no daughter reading by lamplight, just empty rooms that echoed with memories of what once was. But tonight those rooms would serve a purpose. He kicked the door open with his boot and carried the girl inside. The cabin was cold, the fire having died hours ago while he was out working. He laid her gently on the bearskin rug before the hearth and quickly set about building a new fire, his fingers clumsy with cold and haste. The kindling caught, then the smaller logs, and soon a modest flame was licking at the darkness. Not much, but it would have to do for now. He turned back to the girl. She hadn't moved, but her eyes were open, watching him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The oilskin package was still clutched to her chest. "I need to get these wet clothes off you," he explained, keeping his voice gentle. "You're suffering from the cold. Do you understand?" She nodded weakly. With careful movements, Thomas helped her out of the sodden coat. It was a child's coat, but too large for her small frame, likely a hand-me-down or charity. Beneath it, her dress was threadbare and damp. "I'm going to turn around," he said. "There's a blanket on that chair. Can you change out of your wet things and wrap up in it?" Another nod. He turned his back and busied himself with the fire, adding larger logs now that the smaller ones had caught properly. Behind him, he heard the rustle of fabric, then a soft thud as something fell to the floor. "I'm decent," she whispered after a moment. Thomas turned to find her huddled in his wool blanket, her wet clothes in a heap beside her. She kept hold of the oilskin package, which now rested on her lap. The firelight played across her features, revealing more details than he'd seen in the snow. She was young, but her eyes held a weariness that belonged to someone much older. A purplish bruise spread across her left cheek, and smaller bruises circled her wrists like grim bracelets. "My name is Thomas Reeves," he said, hanging her wet clothes on hooks near the fire to dry. "This is my ranch. Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated, as if weighing whether this information was safe to share. "Elizabeth," she finally said. "Elizabeth Morgan." "Elizabeth Morgan," he repeated, nodding as if they were being formally introduced at a social gathering rather than in a freezing cabin in the middle of nowhere. "That's a fine name. Are you hungry?" She nodded eagerly at this, the first sign of childlike response he'd seen. Thomas moved to the cast-iron pot hanging at the side of the fireplace. It contained the remains of a venison stew he'd made that morning, now cold but still edible. He placed it on the hook over the fire to warm. "It's nothing fancy," he said, stirring the contents with a wooden spoon. "Venison, some potatoes, wild onions, but it'll warm you up." While the stew heated, Thomas filled a tin cup with water from the bucket and placed it near enough to the fire to warm but not boil. He'd seen men die in the war after being found near frozen. Well-meaning comrades had given them hot coffee or sat them too close to fires, sending their bodies into shock. Warming had to be gradual. "Small sips," he instructed, handing her the cup once it was just tepid. "Not too fast." Her hands shook so badly that he had to help her, steadying the cup as she took 3 small sips before turning her head away. "Good," he said, setting the cup aside. "We'll try again in a little while." Now that the immediate danger of freezing was addressed, Thomas took stock of his unexpected guest. The brand on her shoulder needed attention, but first things first. He needed to know what had driven a child out into a blizzard and who might be following her. "Elizabeth," he said carefully, "whose mark is that on your shoulder?" She tensed, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "My uncle's," she whispered. "Gerald Donovan." Thomas knew that name. Everyone in Prosperity knew Gerald Donovan. He owned the land office and the bank, held notes on half the businesses in town, and had the ear of Judge Wallace. Thomas himself had borrowed $340 from Donovan's bank last fall to buy winter feed for his horses and cattle. The note came due in April. "Donovan is your uncle?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Elizabeth nodded, staring into the fire. "My pa died in October. Roundup accident. His horse threw him, broke his neck." Her voice was flat, reciting facts without emotion. "After that, Uncle Gerald said I had to come live with him. Said he was my guardian now." The stew began to bubble. Thomas lifted it from the fire and ladled a small portion into a bowl. "Here," he said, placing it on the floor beside her. "Eat slowly." She stared at the food for a long time before picking up the spoon. When she finally began to eat, she did so with careful, measured movements, like someone who'd learned that good things could be snatched away at any moment. Thomas sat in his chair by the fire, giving her space. He didn't press for more information. A child doesn't run through a blizzard at night, especially not one branded like cattle, unless staying put is worse than death. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It held an understanding that some pains don't need immediate words, that safety sometimes means just sitting quietly in the presence of someone who won't hurt you. After she'd eaten about half the stew, Elizabeth spoke again. "He wanted my pa's land," she said, eyes still on the fire. "Pa had 300 head of cattle, good grazing land, water rights to Cottonwood Creek." Thomas nodded. He knew the Morgan place, though not well. It lay about 15 miles to the east, one of the better properties in the county. "Poswell says I inherit everything when I turn 12, she continued. "That's in July." Her hand moved to the oilskin package on her lap. "It's all in here, the will, the deed, everything. Pa had it drawn up proper in Helena last spring when my ma died. Had it witnessed and notarized." She clutched the package tighter. "Uncle Gerald tried to take it, said a girl couldn't own property, that it would all go to him anyway. When I wouldn't give it up, he locked me in the barn at night, said I needed to learn discipline." The brand. Thomas understood now. Donovan had marked her like property because that's how he saw her, a thing to be owned, an obstacle between him and land he coveted. "And now you're here," Thomas said quietly. Elizabeth nodded. "He found where I hid the papers. I heard him talking about burning them, so I ran." The simplicity of her statement belied the courage it must have taken a small, abused child to flee into a Montana winter night, clutching the only proof of her birthright. Thomas was about to respond when a heavy knock rattled the cabin door. 3 solid blows that made the hinges shudder. "Reeves!" a voice called from outside. "Thomas Reeves, open this door!" Elizabeth went rigid, the bowl slipping from her hands and clattering to the floor. Her eyes, wide with terror, fixed on the door. "He's here," she whispered. "He always finds me." Thomas rose from his chair and moved to the wall where his Springfield rifle hung. It was the same weapon he'd carried through the war, a model 1863 with a walnut stock rubbed smooth by years of handling. He checked the load. The cabin had been silent for so long that the metallic click of the action seemed unnaturally loud. "Stay by the fire," he told Elizabeth. "Don't say a word." He crossed to the door and opened it just wide enough to see out, positioning himself so that his body blocked any view of the cabin's interior. His right hand held the rifle at his side, not pointed but ready. Gerald Donovan stood on the other side, his face red from cold and exertion. He was a tall man, well-dressed even out here in the wilderness, his coat lined with fur that had never seen the inside of a trap Thomas had set. Behind him, the lantern Thomas had spotted earlier cast long shadows across the snow. Donovan wasn't alone. Another man, shorter and broader, stood a few paces back, a shotgun cradled in his arms. "Donovan," Thomas acknowledged coldly. "That's my niece you've got in there," Donovan said without preamble. His breath clouded in the frigid air, carrying the scent of expensive tobacco and whiskey. "There's a child," Thomas replied. "She's hurt, branded like she was livestock." Donovan's expression didn't change. "She's a runaway. I'm her legal guardian." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "Got the judge's signature right here. Now step aside or I'll be back in the morning with the marshal." Thomas looked at the paper but made no move to take it. The law might be on Donovan's side, but there were higher principles at stake. He'd seen enough injustice in his life to recognize it standing on his doorstep. "She needs medical attention," Thomas said. "She nearly froze to death out there." "I'll see she gets what she needs," Donovan replied, his tone making it clear that what he thought she needed wasn't a doctor's care. Thomas stood his ground. "Bring the marshal," he said finally. "I'll be here." Donovan's face darkened. For a moment, Thomas thought he might try to force his way inside, marshal or no marshal. But then something calculating entered the banker's eyes. "You owe my bank money, Reeves," he said softly. "Note comes due in April. It would be a shame if we had to call it in early." The threat hung in the air between them, as tangible as the clouds of their breath. Like I said, Thomas repeated, bring the marshal. He closed the door before Donovan could respond, sliding the heavy wooden bar into place across it. Outside, he heard Donovan curse once, sharp and violent in the still night. Then came the crunch of boots through snow, growing fainter as the men retreated. Thomas returned to the fire, setting the rifle aside but within easy reach. Elizabeth sat exactly where he'd left her, trembling despite the growing warmth of the room. Is he gone? She whispered. For now, Thomas assured her, but he'll be back. She nodded, accepting this as inevitable. I'm sorry to bring trouble to your door. Thomas sat in his chair, stretching his hands toward the fire. They were no longer young hands. The skin was weathered, crossed with old scars from barbed wire and rope burns, the knuckles enlarged from years of hard use. They were hands that had killed during the war, hands that had buried a wife and daughter, hands that had worked alone for too many years. You didn't bring trouble, he said. Trouble found you? That's different. She considered this, then asked, what will happen when he comes back? It was a good question. Thomas had no legal right to keep her. He wasn't kin, had no claim that would stand up in court. But he'd seen the terror in her eyes, had seen the brand on her flesh, and knew that returning her to Donovan would be a death sentence of a different kind. We'll figure that out tomorrow, he said. For now, you need sleep. He stood and pulled a bedroll from a shelf, shaking it out before laying it near the fire but not too close. You can sleep here tonight, he said. I'll be right over there if you need anything. He nodded toward his own narrow bed in the corner. Elizabeth didn't move toward the bedroll, just sat staring into the fire, the oilskin package still clutched in her hands. After a while, her head began to droop, exhaustion winning over fear. Then her eyes would snap open again, wide and afraid, as if she'd momentarily forgotten where she was. Thomas remembered this pattern. Catherine had been the same after her mother died, sleep becoming enemy territory, too full of ghosts. He went to a trunk at the foot of his bed and opened it. Inside, carefully folded, was a child's coat, blue wool with wooden buttons carved to look like flowers. It had been Martha's last gift to their daughter before the scarlet fever took them both. He lifted it out, the fabric releasing a faint scent of lavender soap, the kind his wife used to make. This should fit you better than that old coat of yours, he said, returning to Elizabeth. It belonged to my daughter, Catherine. Elizabeth looked up at him. Where is she now? She died, Thomas said simply. 3 years ago. She was 9. Understanding passed between them. The knowing that comes only to those who have lost the essential people in their lives. Elizabeth reached out and took the coat, running her fingers over the carved buttons. Thank you, she said. The first genuine thanks she'd offered, free from fear or calculation. She finally relinquished her grip on the oilskin package long enough to slip her arms into the coat. It fit well enough, a bit long in the sleeves, but otherwise suitable. Then she retrieved the package and held it close again. You should sleep, Thomas repeated, nodding toward the bedroll. This time she obeyed, moving stiffly to the makeshift bed and lying down, the package tucked beneath her head like a pillow. She was asleep almost instantly, her body surrendering to a fatigue so profound it overcame even her fear. Thomas watched her for a long time. The firelight played across her features, softening them in sleep. Without the wariness, she looked even younger, perhaps the same age Catherine would have been now had she lived. The bruise on her cheek stood out starkly against her pale skin, as did the marks on her wrists. And though he couldn't see it now, he knew the brand on her shoulder would leave a scar she'd carry for life. He added another log to the fire, then settled back into his chair. Sleep wouldn't come for him tonight. There was too much to consider, too many decisions to make. Donovan would return, as promised. With the law behind him, the man had wealth, influence, and a legal document naming him guardian. Thomas had nothing but an instinct that had served him well in war, a sense for when violence was imminent, when evil walked disguised as authority. He watched the rise and fall of Elizabeth's chest as she slept, and something long dormant stirred inside him. A feeling he'd thought died with Catherine, the need to protect, to ensure that at least one child in this harsh world would sleep safely through the night. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves of the cabin, finding every crack and seam, its voice like a hungry predator seeking entry. Inside, the fire popped and settled, casting dancing shadows across the worn plank floor. Thomas Reeves sat vigil through the long night, rifle across his knees, as snow began to fall again, blanketing the world in silence. A week passed before Donovan made good on his threat. In that time, Elizabeth slept more than she spoke, waking with nightmares that left her gasping. Thomas would sit with her until the terror passed, his presence a silent assurance that she wasn't alone. During daylight hours, she helped with small tasks around the cabin, feeding the 3 horses he kept, gathering eggs from the half-dozen chickens, carrying firewood from the stack behind the cabin. She moved carefully, like someone who'd learned that drawing attention invited pain. The bruises on her neck and wrists faded from purple to yellow. The whip marks Thomas discovered across her back when helping her apply a salve healed into thin pink lines. But the brand didn't fade. It sat there on her shoulder blade, raised and angry. The letter D burned deep. Thomas didn't ask about it. He didn't need to. A man who would mark a child like livestock had already revealed everything about his character. On the 8th day, Thomas hitched his most reliable horse to the sled and told Elizabeth they were going into town. "He'll be there," she said immediately, her face draining of color. "I know," Thomas acknowledged, "but Dr. Franklin needs to see your injuries and you need proper clothes." The coat she'd arrived in was ruined, the fabric stiff with dried blood and frozen mud. She'd been wearing Catherine's coat and one of Thomas's old shirts cut down to size. Elizabeth didn't argue, just climbed onto the sled and pulled Catherine's coat tight around her shoulders. They rode in silence, the runners hissing over packed snow. The sky was gray and low, threatening more weather. By the time they reached Prosperity, Thomas's beard was white with frost. The town wasn't much a main street lined with false front buildings, a church at one end, a saloon at the other. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, the smell of burning pine and coal mixing with the sharper scent of the blacksmith's forge. Thomas pulled the horse to a stop in front of Dr. Franklin's office, a narrow building wedged between the dry goods store and the land office. But they didn't make it to the door. Well, look what the snow dragged back. Gerald Donovan stood on the church steps 20 yards away. He wasn't alone. A small crowd had gathered after Sunday service, Ruth Wilson from the dry goods store, Thomas Smith the blacksmith, a handful of ranch hands, and Reverend Hayes. They all turned to look. Donovan walked toward them, his boots crunching loud in the quiet. He was dressed fine as always, a wool coat with brass buttons, a hat that probably cost more than Thomas made in a month. He stopped 10 feet from the sled and pointed at Elizabeth. "That man," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "is holding my niece against her will. Kidnapped her right out of my home." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Thomas saw Ruth Wilson frown. The blacksmith shook his head. A few others nodded along with Donovan. They owed him money. They'd nod along with whatever he said. "That true, Thomas?" the blacksmith called out. Thomas climbed down from the sled. Elizabeth stayed where she was, small and silent under the coat. "She came to my door, half frozen," Thomas said. "I gave her food and shelter." "That's not kidnapping, that's Christian duty." "Christian duty?" Donovan laughed, but there wasn't any warmth in it. "You think hiding a child from her lawful guardian is Christian? You think defying a judge's order is righteous?" He pulled the paper from his coat again and held it up. "This here says I'm her guardian, says I have legal custody until she comes of age. You want to argue with the territorial judge, Reeves? You want to argue with the law?" Thomas didn't answer, just stood there, boots planted in the snow, hands loose at his sides. "Didn't think so." Donovan folded the paper and tucked it away. "Now bring her down from that sled. She's coming home with me." "No." The word came from Elizabeth, quiet but clear. She climbed down from the sled before Thomas could stop her, stood there in the snow facing her uncle. She barely came up to his chest. "I ain't going back," she said. Donovan's face went hard. "You'll do what you're told, girl." "No, sir, I won't." For a moment, Thomas thought Donovan might strike her right there in the street. His hand twitched, but he caught himself, remembered the crowd watching. Instead, he smiled. It was worse than the anger. "We'll see about that." He turned to address the onlookers. "This man is in violation of the law. I'll be speaking to Deputy Wallace this afternoon. By tomorrow, we'll have this matter sorted proper." He looked back at Thomas. "You think you're doing her a favor, Reeves? You're just making it harder for both of you." He walked away, back toward the land office. The crowd began to break up, folks drifting back to their wagons and Sunday dinners. A few cast glances their way, some sympathetic, others uncertain. Ruth Wilson lingered on the steps of the dry goods store, her face troubled. She caught Thomas's eye and nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then she went inside. Thomas took Elizabeth's arm, gentle, and guided her toward Dr. Franklin's door. She was shaking, not from cold this time. Dr. Franklin was a lean man with gray in his beard and steady hands. He'd been a field surgeon during the war, seen things that left shadows in his eyes, but he was kind. He examined Elizabeth in the back room while Thomas waited by the stove. the smell of carbolic soap and camphor thick in the air. When the doctor came out, his face was grim. "That brand is 2 weeks old, maybe 3, he said quietly. "The whip marks are older. There's scarring on her back that goes back months." He paused. "This isn't discipline, Thomas. This is livestock treatment." "Can you document it?" Thomas asked. "I already have. Photographs, measurements, notes. I'll lock it all in my safe." He glanced toward the back room where Elizabeth was getting dressed. "But you need to understand something. Donovan has the law on his side. A guardian can discipline a child as he sees fit. There's no statute against it. Not out here. Then the law's broken." "Maybe so," Franklin said, "but it's still the law." The doctor poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and handed one to Thomas. "You prepared for what's coming?" he asked. "I don't have much choice." "You do? You could put her on the next stage east. Send her to relatives if she's got any. She doesn't, then you're in for a fight." Thomas drank the coffee. It was bitter and too hot, but he needed something to do with his hands. Through the window, he could see the land office across the street. Donovan was visible through the glass, talking to Deputy Wallace. They both looked his way. "Let them come," Thomas said. Franklin sighed. "You're a stubborn man, Thomas Reeves." "So I've been told." When Elizabeth came out, Dr. Franklin had given her a clean dress from the charity box the church kept. It was too big, but she'd rolled the sleeves. She looked like a child again, not a ghost. Franklin knelt down to her level. "You're going to be fine," he said, "but if you ever need help, you come straight here. Doesn't matter what time it is, understand?" She nodded. They left through the back door. Thomas didn't want to walk past the land office again. They took the long way around, past the blacksmith's forge, where the fire roared and the air smelled of hot metal and coal smoke. When they reached the sled, Deputy Wallace was waiting. He was young, maybe 30, with a badge pinned to his coat and an apologetic look on his face. He held 2 folded papers in his hand. "Thomas," he said, "I'm sorry, but I got to serve you these." He handed Thomas the papers. Thomas opened the first one. The words were legal and formal, but the meaning was plain enough. Gerald Donovan was calling in his debt. $340 due by the 1st of May, 6 weeks from now. "If you can't pay," Deputy Wallace said quietly, "he can seize your property. The ranch, the horses, everything." Thomas folded the paper and put it in his pocket. Elizabeth watched with wide eyes. "Anything else?" Thomas asked. The deputy hesitated. Then he pulled out the second paper. "He's also filed a complaint. Says you're harboring a runaway. If I find cause to believe it, I'm obliged to bring her back to him." "You gonna do that?" Wallace looked at Elizabeth, looked at Thomas, then shook his head slowly. "Not today." He lowered his voice. "But Thomas, he's not going to let this go. You know that, don't you?" "I know." The deputy tipped his hat and walked away. Thomas climbed onto the sled. Elizabeth climbed up beside him. They rode out of town in silence, the runners cutting through snow that had started to fall again. By the time they reached the ranch, it was dark. Thomas unhitched the horse and fed the animals. Elizabeth sat by the fire, staring at the flames. After a while, she spoke. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" "For bringing trouble." Thomas sat down across from her. "You didn't bring trouble. Trouble found you. That's different." She looked at the oilskin pouch still sitting on the shelf where she'd left it. "That paper he keeps talking about. The judge's order. What about it?" "It's a lie," she said. "My Poswell says I inherit the ranch when I turn 12. That's in July. Uncle Gerald wants the land before then. If I'm gone, he gets it all." Thomas understood then. It wasn't about guardianship. It was about $12,000 in cattle and grazing rights. It was about greed. "He won't get it," Thomas said. "How do you know?" "Because I gave you my word you'd be safe, and I don't break my word." She looked at him for a long time, then finally she nodded. Outside, the wind picked up. Thomas could hear it howling around the eaves, rattling the shutters. Winter wasn't done with them yet. Neither was Gerald Donovan. Ruth Wilson showed up 2 days later, riding a mule with a basket strapped to the saddle. The smell of fresh bread reached Thomas before she did, yeast and butter still warm from the oven. She was a sturdy woman around 60 with gray hair pinned tight and eyes that didn't miss much. She'd lost her husband to pneumonia 5 years back and her only son to the war 20 years before that. She ran the dry goods store alone and took nonsense from nobody. "Figured you could use provisions," she said, climbing down, "and company that don't come with a badge or a threat." Thomas took the basket. Inside were 2 loaves of bread, a jar of preserves, coffee, and a small sack of cornmeal. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know I didn't." She looked toward the cabin. The girl inside? She is. Good. I want to meet her. Elizabeth was at the table working through the letters Thomas had been teaching her. She could read some already. Her father had seen to that, but her schooling had stopped when he died. She looked up when Ruth came in, wary as a young doe at the edge of a clearing. Don't worry, child, Ruth said. I'm not here to drag you anywhere. She set a smaller bundle on the table wrapped in brown paper. Brought you something. Elizabeth unwrapped it slowly. Inside were 3 dresses, all patched but clean, and a pair of boots only slightly too big. I can't pay for these, she said quietly. Didn't ask you to, Ruth replied. These were donated to the church charity box. Nobody's using them. Ruth pulled out a chair and sat down. Now I want to hear your side of things. Not what Donovan says, not what the town's whispering. You tell me. Elizabeth glanced at Thomas. He nodded. She took a breath and started talking. She told it plain. How her father had died in October when his horse threw him during Roundup. How the will said she'd inherit the ranch, 300 head of cattle, good grazing land, water rights when she turned 12. How Gerald had come for her the day after the funeral claiming guardianship. How the first month hadn't been so bad, but then she'd overheard him talking to a man from Helena about selling her father's land. When she'd asked about it, he'd told her to mind her business. That's when he started locking me in the barn at night, she said. Her voice stayed steady, but her hands twisted the fabric of her dress. Said I needed to learn discipline. Said I was ungrateful. Ruth's face went hard at the mention of the brand. Elizabeth pulled the collar of her dress aside. The D was still angry red against her skin. He said I was property now, same as his cattle. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they were wet. Lord, forgive me, she whispered, but I hope that man rots. Ruth, Thomas started. Don't Ruth me, Thomas Reeves, she said sharply. I've known Gerald Donovan for 15 years. He's a hard man, always has been. But I never thought... She stopped, collected herself. His wife died 3 years back. Childbirth. The baby too. He blamed her for being weak. Said women were too fragile for this country. She looked at Elizabeth. I think he's been punishing her through you. The cabin fell quiet except for the fire crackling and the wind whispering under the door. Outside, Thomas could hear the horses moving in the corral, their hooves crunching through crusted snow. Ruth stood. I deliver bread to the land office every Wednesday. Donovan is always there going through files. She looked at Thomas. If he's planning something, there will be paperwork. I can keep my eyes open. That could put you in danger. I'm an old woman running a store. Nobody pays attention to old women. She pulled her coat tighter. Besides, my store is mortgaged to his bank too. He comes after you, he might come after me next. I'd rather see trouble coming. She left before the sun set, riding back toward town through the gray afternoon light. After she was gone, Elizabeth tried on the dresses. They fit well enough. She stood by the window in one of them, dark blue with white buttons, and watched the snow beginning to fall again. Why is she helping us, she asked. Because it's right. Lots of people know what's right. They don't all help. She wasn't wrong. Thomas had seen plenty of folks in town look away when they passed them on the street. Seen them duck into doorways to avoid conversation. Fear does that. Fear of debt, fear of power, fear of standing alone. Ruth's different, he said. She buried a son and a husband. Once you've lost that much, you stop being afraid of men like Donovan. Elizabeth thought about that. Are you afraid, she asked. Thomas was mending a bridle, the leather stiff and cracked from cold. The smell of Neat's foot oil filled the cabin as he worked it into the straps. I'm afraid of failing you, he said. I'm afraid of not being strong enough or smart enough when it matters. But I'm not afraid of Donovan. Why not? Because I've already lost the things I love most. There's not much he can take from me that hasn't already been taken. She came and sat across from him, watched him work the leather for a while. Then she said, I found her coat, the one you gave me that first night. There was a name sewn inside, Catherine. Thomas didn't look up, just kept working the oil into the bridle. My daughter. What happened to her? Scarlet fever, 3 years ago. She was 9. He set the bridle aside. We lived 40 miles from the nearest doctor back then. By the time I got her to town, it was too late. I'm sorry. So am I. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. It was small and warm and alive. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she pulled back and picked up the book they had been reading, a collection of McGuffey's readers Thomas had kept from Catherine's schooling. Will you teach me the next lesson? She asked. They worked until the light failed. She was a quick study, sounding out words carefully, her left hand tracing the lines on the page. When she stumbled, Thomas would help her. When she got it right, he'd nod. It was a small thing, teaching a child to read. But out here in the middle of winter, with the world pressing in from all sides, it felt like the only thing that mattered. By the time they finished, full dark had fallen. Thomas lit the lamp and started supper. Salt pork and beans, nothing fancy. Elizabeth set the table without being asked. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes when two people start to trust each other. After supper, she went to the shelf and took down the oilskin pouch. She opened it carefully and pulled out a folded paper. Your paper yellowed and creased. She handed it to Thomas. My pa's will, she said. It's the only proof I got. Uncle Gerald tried to take it, but I hid it in the barn. That's why I ran. He figured out where it was. Thomas unfolded it. The handwriting was careful and clear. It laid out everything. The land, the cattle, the water rights, all to be held in trust until Elizabeth reached the age of 12, at which point it would pass to her free and clear. It was witnessed and notarized, legal. He needs this gone, Thomas said. Without it, he can claim there was no will, that you're just an orphan with no claim. That's why I can't let him have it. Thomas folded the paper and handed it back. Then we keep it safe, and come July, you take what's yours. She put it back in the pouch and set it on the shelf. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire burned warm. They sat together in the lamplight, and for a little while, the world outside didn't matter. But Thomas knew it wouldn't last. Men like Donovan don't give up. They just change tactics. And somewhere out there in the dark, he was planning his next move. March came in cold and mean. The snow turned to ice, then back to snow, then to a slush that froze hard at night and made every step treacherous. The horses grew shaggy and ill-tempered. The chickens stopped laying. And Deputy Wallace rode up to the cabin with a paper that might as well have been a death warrant. He didn't dismount, just sat his horse and held out the folded document, his breath steaming in the gray morning air. Eviction notice, he said. Donovan called in your debt. $340 due by the 1st of May. If you can't pay, the ranch goes to the bank. Thomas took the paper. The words were formal and cold, legal theft dressed up in official language. 6 weeks, Thomas said. I'm sorry, Thomas. I tried to talk him out of it. The deputy's face was troubled. But he owns the note, and the law's on his side. Law seems to be on his side a lot lately. Wallace looked away. I don't like it either, but I wear a badge. I enforce what's written, not what's fair. You ever wonder if there's a difference? He didn't answer, just turned his horse and rode back toward town, the animal's hooves breaking through the crust of ice with each step. The sound echoed in the stillness long after he disappeared into the trees. Inside, Elizabeth was feeding kindling to the fire. She looked up when Thomas came in, saw his face, and went still. What happened? He told her, watched the color drain from her cheeks as she understood what it meant. No ranch meant no place to keep her. No place to keep her meant Donovan won. How much do you have? She asked. $70, maybe $80 if I sell the mule and 2 of the horses. That's not enough. No, it's not. She stood there, small and fierce in one of Ruth's hand-me-down dresses, her hands balled into fists. It's my fault. If I hadn't come here. Stop. Thomas crossed to her, knelt down so they were eye to eye. You didn't bring this. Donovan did. He's the one twisting the law to suit himself. You're just a child trying to survive. But you're going to lose everything because of me. I already lost everything that mattered 3 years ago when Catherine died. He put a hand on her shoulder. This ranch is just wood and land. You're alive. There's no choice to make here. She started to cry then, quiet sobs that shook her whole body. Thomas pulled her close and let her cry it out. The smell of wood smoke clung to her hair. Outside, a crow called, harsh and lonely. When she'd calmed, Thomas made them coffee, weak because supplies were running low, and they sat by the fire. He had 2 choices, and neither was good. He could try to raise the money, which was near impossible, or he could take Elizabeth and run, head west to Oregon Territory, where Donovan's reach didn't extend. But running meant looking over their shoulders for the rest of their lives. Meant teaching her that might makes right, that powerful men always win. He couldn't do that, wouldn't. We fight, he said. How? I don't know yet, but Ruth's watching. Doc has evidence. And somewhere Donovan has a weak spot. Every man does. 3 days later, Donovan called a town meeting. Not official business, just an invitation delivered by hand to every property owner in Prosperity. The meeting would be held at the church Sunday after service. The subject, community concerns regarding the protection of minors. Ruth came out to warn them. It's a trap, she said, standing in Thomas's doorway with snow melting off her shawl. He's going to paint you as a criminal in front of everyone. Get them on his side before any of this goes to a real court. I'm going anyway. I figured you'd say that, she sighed. Then I'm going too, and I'm bringing anyone who'll listen to reason. Sunday came clear and cold. The sky was that hard blue you only see in winter, and the sunlight off the snow was bright enough to hurt. Thomas dressed in his best shirt, which wasn't saying much, and hitched the horse to the sled. Elizabeth wore the blue dress Ruth had brought, and Thomas wrapped Catherine's coat around her shoulders. You don't have to come, he told her. Yes, I do. This is about me. I should be there. They rode into town in silence. The church was already full when they arrived. Folks packed into the pews, their voices a low murmur that stopped when Thomas and Elizabeth walked through the door. Thomas felt every eye on them, some sympathetic, most uncertain, a few openly hostile. Donovan stood at the front next to the preacher's pulpit. He was dressed like a politician, black suit, white shirt, string tie. He looked prosperous and respectable. Everything Thomas wasn't. When he saw them, he smiled. Good of you to come, Thomas, and you brought the girl. Even better. He addressed the crowd. Folks, thank you for gathering. I know it's cold and you've got work waiting, but this concerns all of us. It concerns the rule of law in this territory. He let that hang in the air. Then he pulled out the guardianship paper and held it up. This document, signed by Judge Wallace himself, names me as Elizabeth Morgan's legal guardian. My brother, God rest him, died without proper provision for his daughter. As her only living relative, it falls to me to raise her, to see to her education and welfare. He paused. But Mr. Reeves has decided the law doesn't apply to him. He's harboring a minor against her guardian's wishes. That's kidnapping, plain and simple. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Thomas saw heads nodding. Donovan had them. Now, I'm a patient man, he continued. I've tried reasoning with Thomas. I've sent the deputy with proper notice. But he refuses to comply, and that puts all of us at risk. Because if one man can ignore the law, what's to stop others? What's to stop chaos? He turned to look at Thomas. I don't want trouble, Thomas. I just want my niece returned to her rightful home. Is that so much to ask? The church was silent. Everyone waited. Thomas could feel Elizabeth trembling beside him. He stood and stepped into the aisle. You want to talk about law, he said. Let's talk about it. You brand a child like cattle. Is that lawful? You lock her in a barn at night? Is that proper guardianship? You forge documents to steal her inheritance. Is that righteous? Gasps. Donovan's face went red. That's slander. It's truth. Thomas looked at the crowd. Doc Franklin's got photographs of what he did to her. Photographs of the brand on her shoulder, the whip marks on her back. Any of you want to see them? The discipline of a child is a guardian's right. Donovan's voice rose. You don't have children, Thomas. You don't understand what it takes to raise a stubborn girl in this country. I had a daughter, Thomas said. She died before you could teach me how to beat her into submission. The words came out harder than he'd meant them. The church went dead quiet. Thomas saw Ruth in the third row, her eyes shining, saw Dr. Franklin near the back, arms crossed, saw Deputy Wallace by the door, his face troubled. Donovan recovered quickly. I grieve for your loss, Thomas. I truly do. But your pain doesn't give you the right to steal another man's kin. He turned back to the crowd. He owes my bank $340. Come May, he'll lose his land. Is that the kind of man you want raising a child? A debtor? A thief? Someone in the crowd called out, How'd he come to owe you that money, Gerald? It was Thomas Smith, the blacksmith, a big man with soot-stained hands. Once a slave in Kentucky, now a free man with his own business. One of the few who'd nodded to Thomas when they passed on the street. Donovan blinked. What? Just wondering how a man who don't borrow much suddenly owes you a debt right when he takes in your niece. Seems convenient. I don't appreciate your tone, Donovan said, his voice colder. And I don't appreciate you questioning my business dealings in a house of God. I ain't questioning your business, Smith replied. I'm questioning your timing. Thomas Reeves has been in this valley longer than most of us. Never caused trouble, never asked for much. Now you're saying he's a criminal because he gave shelter to a freezing child? Murmurs again, but this time they were different, uncertain. Donovan's jaw tightened. The law is clear. If he doesn't return Elizabeth by week's end, I'll have the marshal brought in from Helena. This isn't a negotiation. He turned and walked out, his boots loud on the wooden floor. The crowd began to break up, folks filing out in small groups, talking in low voices. Ruth came over, squeezed Thomas's arm. Dr. Franklin nodded. Deputy Wallace approached slowly. "He's not bluffing about the marshal," he said quietly. "Once that happens, it's out of my hands." "I know." Wallace looked at Elizabeth, then back at Thomas. "The law ain't always just, but it's all we got. Without it, we're just animals." "And when the law protects animals over children," Thomas asked, "what then?" He had no answer. He left. Outside, the sun was already sinking. The temperature was dropping fast, the way it does in March. Winter's last cruel joke. Elizabeth and Thomas climbed onto the sled. As they pulled away, Thomas saw Donovan standing outside the land office watching them. Even from a distance, he could see the rage in his posture. He'd expected to win today. Expected the town to turn against Thomas. It hadn't quite worked, but he'd drawn the lines clear. Come May, Thomas would lose the ranch, and without the ranch, he'd have no ground to stand on. Elizabeth was quiet on the ride home. When they reached the cabin, she went straight to the shelf and took down the oilskin pouch. She held it for a long time, staring at it. "What if I gave him the land?" she said. "What if I had just signed it over? Then he'd leave you alone." "No," Thomas said firmly. "That land is yours. Your father worked himself to death to build it. You don't hand it over to a man who'd rather burn you than let you have it." "Then what do we do?" Thomas looked out the window. The sun was gone, the sky fading to deep purple. Stars were beginning to show, cold and distant. "We wait," he said, "and we hope Ruth finds something we can use." But hope felt thin that night, thin as the ice forming on the water bucket, thin as the thread holding his whole life together. April crept in with mud and cold rain. The snow didn't melt so much as rot away, leaving the ground soft and treacherous. The horses sank to their fetlocks in the muck. Water dripped from the cabin eaves in an endless rhythm that sounded like a clock counting down. Thomas sold 2 horses to a rancher passing through, got $40 for the pair, sold the mule for 20 more. That gave him 140 total, still 200 short. The 1st of May was 3 weeks away. Elizabeth had gone quiet, not the frightened quiet of when she first arrived, but something harder, determined. She worked alongside Thomas without complaint, feeding the remaining horse, hauling water from the creek, chopping kindling. Her hands got rough and calloused. She didn't ask about the dead anymore. Didn't talk much at all. One afternoon, Thomas found her in the corner of the cabin where he kept his tools. She had Catherine's old McGuffey's reader open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was copying words onto a scrap of paper, practicing her letters. Her left hand moved carefully across the page, forming each letter with precision. "What are you working on?" Thomas asked. She showed him. It was her name written over and over. Elizabeth Morgan, Elizabeth Morgan, Elizabeth Morgan. The letters were neat and clear, all slanting slightly to the left, the way a left-handed person's writing does. "Why?" he asked. "So I don't forget who I am," she said, "no matter what happens." Thomas sat down next to her. The smell of wet earth and old wood filled the cabin. Outside, rain pattered on the tin roof, a sound both comforting and relentless. "You want to learn something?" he asked. She nodded. "Come with me." He took her out to the corral where he kept the last horse, a young stallion he'd been working with since fall. The animal was wild caught, maybe 4 years old, with a black coat and white blaze down his face. Mean as spit when Thomas had first roped him, but he'd been gentling him slow. Patience, not force. The stallion eyed them as they approached. Ears back, nostrils flared. "This is trust," Thomas said. "You can break a horse with whips and spurs, make him fear you so much he'll obey. But that's not trust. That's just fear wearing a saddle." He climbed over the fence. The stallion tossed his head but didn't bolt. Thomas moved slow, keeping his hands visible, talking low and steady. When he got close enough, he held out his palm. The stallion snorted, danced sideways, then finally stretched his neck and sniffed Thomas's hand. "You earn it," he said, "little bit at a time. You show him you're not there to hurt him. Eventually, he stops expecting pain. That's when real work can begin." Elizabeth watched from the fence. "Can I try?" she asked. "You sure?" She nodded. Thomas helped her over the rail. The stallion's ears pricked forward, curious. Elizabeth was smaller than Thomas, less threatening. She held out her hand the way Thomas had, palm up, fingers loose. "Talk to him," Thomas instructed. "Use that voice you use when you're scared, the quiet one." She did. A whisper, soft and steady, the same tone she'd used that first night when she asked if she was real. The stallion took a step closer, then another. Finally, he lowered his head and touched her palm with his muzzle. Elizabeth's face lit up. Not quite a smile, she didn't smile much yet, but something close. Something like hope. He trusts you, Thomas said. How do you know? Because he's letting you be close. That's all trust is. Letting someone be close even when you're afraid they might hurt you. They worked with the horse for an hour until the rain picked up and drove them inside. That night, Thomas made stew from the last of the salt pork. They ate by firelight, the cabin warm and dry, despite the storm raging outside. Elizabeth asked him about breaking horses, about how long it took, whether they ever forgot their fear. Depends, Thomas said. Some horses carry it their whole lives. Others let it go once they learn different. People are the same way. She thought about that. Do you think I'll forget? She asked. Forget what? Being afraid. Thomas set down his spoon. I don't think you forget, but I think maybe you learn to carry it different. Learn that being afraid don't mean being broken. She nodded slowly. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm was moving east toward town. 3 weeks to May, she said. I know. What happens if we can't pay? Then we figure out the next thing. What's the next thing? Thomas didn't have an answer, so he just said, we'll know when we get there. But the truth was he didn't know. The money wasn't coming. The land would go to Donovan's bank, and without the ranch, he had no legal standing to keep Elizabeth. Deputy Wallace had made that clear. A man without property was a vagrant, and vagrants didn't get to raise children. Thomas lay awake that night, listening to the rain and Elizabeth's breathing from the corner where she slept. The fire had burned down to coals. In the darkness, he could almost see Catherine's face, the way she'd looked the last time he'd seen her alive, fever bright and asking for water. He'd failed her, ridden 40 miles to fetch a doctor who'd arrived too late. He couldn't fail again. But he was running out of options, and time and hope. The rain fell harder. Somewhere in the darkness, a branch cracked and fell, and the sound of it felt like an ending. Ruth showed up on a Wednesday, 2 weeks before the debt came due. She rode through the mud with her skirts soaked to the knees and her face set hard. Thomas knew before she said a word that she'd found something. Land office, she said, climbing down from her horse. I was delivering bread like always. Donovan was arguing with his bank partner, a man named Bennett from Helena. They didn't know I was in the back room. Inside, she sat by the fire and pulled a folded paper from inside her coat. The paper was damp but readable. Thomas recognized the territorial seal at the top. Orphan train contract, Ruth said, dated March 20th, says Elizabeth Morgan voluntarily consents to relocation east for proper schooling and placement with a Christian family. It's signed by her, witnessed by Donovan. Elizabeth went pale. I never signed that. I know you didn't, Ruth pointed to the signature. Look at the handwriting. It slants right. You're left-handed. Your writing slants left. I checked with Doc Franklin. He had you write your name when he examined you. This signature is a forgery. Thomas held the paper up to the light. The signature was neat and careful. Too neat. Practiced. He's planning to put her on the train, Thomas said. Train leaves June 10th, Ruth confirmed. Once she's gone, he can claim abandonment. Say she ran off. Without her here to contest it, the inheritance defaults to him as next of kin. Elizabeth's hands were shaking. Can we show this to the deputy? She asked. Ruth shook her head. Not yet. Donovan will just say you signed it and forgot, or that you're lying to stay with Thomas. We need more. Like what? Like why he needs that land so badly right now. Ruth leaned forward. I heard him tell Bennett the bank examiner's coming in June. He said something about covering the shortfall before anyone notices. Those were his exact words. The pieces started fitting together. A man doesn't forge documents and call in debts unless he's desperate. And Donovan was desperate. He's stealing from the bank, Thomas said. That's my guess. Elizabeth's inheritance is $12,000. If he can get that land and sell it quick, he can cover whatever he took before the examiner arrives. Thomas looked at Elizabeth. She sat very still, her face pale but her eyes sharp. She understood what this meant. Her uncle wasn't just cruel, he was a thief using her to save himself. We need proof, Thomas said. I'm working on it. Ruth's voice dropped. But Thomas, this is dangerous. If Donovan finds out I'm looking, he'll move against me. My store is mortgaged to his bank too. Then stop looking. I didn't say I was stopping, Ruth said. I said it's dangerous. She stood. I'll keep my ears open. You just keep that girl safe. She left before the sunset, riding back through the mud toward town. After she was gone, Elizabeth came and stood beside Thomas at the window. They watched the sky turn purple, the clouds breaking apart to show stars. "He's going to win, isn't he?" she said. "Not if I can help it. But you can't pay the debt, and he's got the law on his side." Thomas turned to face her. "The law is just words on paper. What matters is what people choose to believe. And Ruth believes you, Doc believes you. Even Smith the blacksmith is starting to ask questions. That's 3 people against a whole town. 3 is more than 0. She looked up at him. "Why are you doing this? You could just let me go. Save your ranch." "The ranch is wood and nails," Thomas said. "You're alive. But you already lost so much." "That's exactly why." Thomas knelt down so they were eye level. "When Catherine died, I thought I was done. Thought I'd just work this land until it buried me too. Then you showed up half frozen, asking if you were real. And I remembered what it felt like to matter to someone, to have a reason to get up in the morning." He paused. "You saved me, Elizabeth. Least I can do is return the favor." Her eyes filled with tears. She threw her arms around his neck and held on tight. Thomas held her back, this small, fierce girl who'd walked through a blizzard with nothing but a piece of paper and a question. Outside, the night settled in. The mud would freeze again by morning. The debt was still coming due. Donovan was still planning. But for now, in this moment, they had each other. And sometimes that's enough to keep fighting. The next morning, Thomas rode into town alone. Elizabeth wanted to come, but he told her to stay with the horse. What he was about to do didn't need witnesses. He found Donovan at the land office, sitting behind a desk covered in ledgers and papers. He looked up when Thomas walked in, his face showing neither surprise nor concern. "Come to beg?" he asked. "Come to make you an offer." "I'm listening." "You drop the debt. Give me clear title to my land. In exchange, I'll convince Elizabeth to sign over her inheritance. No fight, no fuss." Donovan leaned back in his chair. For a moment, Thomas thought he might actually consider it. Then he smiled. "No," he said. "I'll have both. Your land and hers. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it." Thomas turned and walked out. Behind him, he heard Donovan laugh, but he'd gotten what he came for. He'd seen Donovan's face when he mentioned the inheritance, seen the hunger there, the desperation barely hidden. Ruth was right. He needed that money, needed it bad. And desperate men make mistakes. The 1st of May came with a morning so clear it hurt to look at. The sky was blue and infinite, the kind of day that makes you believe in second chances. Thomas didn't believe in them anymore. Deputy Wallace arrived at noon with a surveyor and a clerk from the territorial office. They carried papers and measuring chains and expressions that said they'd done this before and would do it again. The law was the law, and the law didn't care about clear skies. "I'm sorry, Thomas," Wallace said. He wouldn't meet Thomas's eyes. "You got till sundown to clear out." Thomas nodded. Elizabeth stood in the doorway behind him, her face pale but set. They had talked about this, knew it was coming, but knowing doesn't make it easier. "Where will you go?" the deputy asked. "Don't know yet." He looked past Thomas at Elizabeth. "You know what happens next, don't you? Without property, you've got no legal standing to keep her. Donovan will file for immediate custody." "I know. You could make this easier for both of you." Thomas looked at him then, really looked at him. He was a young man trying to do his job, trying to enforce rules he didn't believe in because the alternative was chaos. But there's a difference between law and justice, and he knew it. Thomas could see it in his eyes. "No," Thomas said, "I couldn't." They measured and marked and wrote everything down in careful script. By mid-afternoon, the ranch officially belonged to Gerald Donovan's bank. The cabin, the corral, the remaining horse, all of it. The surveyor hammered the stake into the ground near the fence line and tied a red ribbon to it. The ribbon fluttered in the breeze like a flag of surrender. After they left, Thomas and Elizabeth stood in the yard. The sun was warm on their faces. Birds sang in the cottonwoods. The world didn't care that they had just lost everything. "What now?" she asked. Thomas didn't answer right away. Just stood there looking at the cabin he'd built with his own hands. The fence line he'd mended 100 times. The grave marker in the corner of the property where Catherine was buried. Leaving felt like dying, but staying meant watching Donovan take Elizabeth, and he'd burn the place down before he let that happen. "We pack what we can carry," he said, "and we figure out the rest as we go." Inside, he gathered Catherine's coat, the McGuffey's reader, a blanket, some tools. Elizabeth wrapped the oilskin pouch with her father's will in a cloth and tucked it inside her dress. They moved quiet and efficient, like soldiers retreating from a battlefield. Thomas was loading the saddlebags when he heard it. The church bell in town, ringing hard and fast. Not the slow, measured toll for service. This was urgent, alarmed. Elizabeth heard it too. "What does that mean?" "Trouble," Thomas said, "or a call to gather." He looked toward town. The sound carried clear across the distance, echoing off the hills. Ruth. He knew it in his bones. Ruth had found something, and she was calling the town to witness it. This was the move they had been waiting for. "Stay here," he told Elizabeth. "No," her voice was firm. "This is about me. I should be there." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to keep her safe, hidden, away from whatever was about to happen. But she was right. This was her fight as much as his. "All right," he said, "but you stay close to me, no matter what." They rode double on the horse, moving fast through the mud-rutted road toward town. The bell kept ringing, insistent and loud. As they got closer, Thomas could see people streaming toward the church from all directions. Ranch hands and shopkeepers, families and drifters. Whatever Ruth had done, she'd made sure everyone would see it. When they reached the church, the crowd was already thick. Folks parted to let them through, their faces curious and uncertain. At the front steps, Ruth stood holding a stack of papers. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright with something between triumph and terror. Beside her stood Dr. Franklin, and beside him, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, stood Deputy Wallace. Donovan was there too, standing near the church door. His face was red with rage. Ruth saw Thomas and nodded. Then she raised her voice to carry across the crowd. "Folks," she said, "I got something to show you. Something you all need to see before this goes any further." She held up the papers. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the territorial seal, official documents, the kind that told truths men like Donovan wanted buried. "This here," Ruth said, "is proof that Gerald Donovan has been stealing from his own bank. $12,000 to be exact. And he's been using that little girl's inheritance to cover his tracks." The crowd erupted. Donovan lunged toward Ruth, but Dr. Franklin stepped between them. Deputy Wallace's hand went to his gun. "You lying witch," Donovan shouted. "Those are private bank records. You had no right." "I had every right," Ruth said. Her voice was steady. "Because you were about to ruin an innocent man and steal from a child to save your own skin." She looked at Thomas, then at Elizabeth, then back at the crowd. "Now somebody better decide," she said, "if we're a town that protects children or a town that protects thieves." The bell had stopped ringing. In the silence that followed, every eye turned toward Gerald Donovan, and Thomas knew finally that they had won. Reverend Hayes stepped forward, his Bible clutched in both hands. He was an old man, thin and gray, but his voice carried the weight of moral authority earned through decades of tending to his flock. "This is the house of God," he said, his voice resonating through the church. "And in this house, we settle things according to his law, not man's greed." He turned to face Donovan directly. The banker's face had lost its usual arrogant composure, replaced by a pallor that spoke of fear. "You stand accused of theft and fraud. You got anything to say in your defense?" Donovan's hands trembled visibly as he smoothed his expensive coat. "Those records are sealed," he said, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. She had no authority to access them. Ruth Wilson stepped forward, her chin held high, years of quiet dignity evident in her bearing. "I had a key," she said calmly. "You gave it to me yourself, Gerald, remember? Said I could use the back room to store dry goods. Called it overflow space." She held up the papers again, making sure everyone could see the territorial seal. "While I was there, I paid attention. I saw the ledgers, saw the withdrawals, saw how the numbers didn't match up. $12,000 missing, the exact value of Elizabeth's inheritance." Deputy Adam Wallace stepped forward, his badge catching the light that streamed through the church windows. "Let me see those records, Ruth." She handed them over without hesitation. The deputy read slowly, his lips moving slightly as he traced the columns of figures with his finger. Thomas could see the moment realization dawned on the young lawman's face. Wallace looked up, meeting Donovan's eyes. "This true, Gerald? You've been taking from depositors' accounts?" "It was temporary," Donovan said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I was going to pay it back with Elizabeth's inheritance once I sold her father's land." Dr. Franklin spoke up from where he stood at the back of the crowd. "That's why you needed her land so desperately. Why you forged those orphan train papers." The crowd pressed closer, hungry for justice. Thomas saw the blacksmith, Thomas Smith, with soot still on his massive hands from the morning's work. He saw store clerks who'd averted their eyes when Thomas and Elizabeth passed. He saw ranch hands who'd worked Donovan's land. They were listening now. really listening. Donovan straightened his shoulders, attempting to recover some dignity. Even if that were true, which I'm not admitting, the girl's still my ward. Judge Wallace signed the papers. He pulled the guardianship document from his pocket and held it up. This makes it legal. The judge signed based on your testimony that you were a fit guardian, Ruth interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. But Doc Franklin's got photographs of what you did to her. The brand, the whip marks. Does that sound like a fit guardian to you folks? Angry murmurs rippled through the crowd. Thomas felt Elizabeth press closer to his side, her small hand finding his. Reverend Hayes raised his hand for quiet. There's a law in this territory, one that predates most of us settling here. Old homestead law from the 1850s, when judges were scarce and communities had to govern themselves. It states that in cases of disputed guardianship, a town congregation can vote on placement, provided there's clear evidence of harm or unfitness. That law is outdated, Donovan protested, desperation creeping into his voice. That law is still on the books, Deputy Wallace said quietly. I checked it myself last week. Reverend Hayes is right. The Reverend nodded solemnly. Then we'll do this proper, according to both God's law and territorial statute. He turned to Elizabeth. Child, do you wish to speak before we vote? Elizabeth had been standing beside Thomas, silent and watchful. Now she stepped forward, her small figure framed against the larger backdrop of the church. She wore Ruth's hand-me-down dress, blue with white buttons, and Catherine's coat that Thomas had given her that first night. She looked like what she was, just a girl in borrowed clothes. But when she spoke, her voice carried a strength that belied her years. My name is Elizabeth Morgan, she said. My pa died last October. Before he died, he wrote a will that says I inherit his ranch when I turn 12. That's 2 months from now. She reached into her dress and pulled out the oilskin pouch that had never left her possession. Her hands were steady as she opened it and took out the yellowed paper. This is the will. It's legal and witnessed. My uncle wanted it gone so he could take the land for himself. She held up her left arm, showing the sleeve of Catherine's coat. Then she pulled it back, exposing the brand on her shoulder. Several women in the crowd gasped. One turned away, hand over her mouth. He did this to me, Elizabeth continued, her voice catching slightly. Said I was his property, like a cow, like something he could mark and sell. Her voice broke, but she pushed on. Mr. Reeves found me in a blizzard in February. I was dying. He didn't have to help me. He didn't know me. But he did. She looked back at Thomas, her eyes bright with unshed tears. And he's been protecting me ever since, even when it cost him everything. She turned back to the congregation. He taught me that I'm worth more than a piece of paper, that I'm real even without the deed, that I matter. Thomas felt his throat tighten. This brave, determined child had endured so much. Yet here she stood, fighting for her future with a courage that humbled him. Elizabeth faced the crowd directly. I'm asking you, please don't send me back. Please. The silence that followed was profound. Even the spring wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Reverend Hayes broke the silence. We'll put it to a vote. All in favor of granting temporary guardianship to Thomas Reeves until Elizabeth reaches her majority in July, say aye. Thomas Smith, the blacksmith, spoke first, his deep voice ringing out. Aye. Then Ruth. Aye. Dr. Franklin followed. Aye. One by one, voices rose from the crowd. Not everyone spoke. Some remained silent, perhaps afraid of crossing Donovan even now, or unwilling to challenge the established order. But enough spoke. More than enough. When the count finished, it was 14-6. Reverend Hayes nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered face. Then it's settled. Thomas Reeves is granted temporary guardianship until Elizabeth Morgan reaches age 12 and can claim her inheritance according to her father's will. He turned to Donovan, who stood frozen in disbelief. As for you, Gerald, Deputy Wallace will be taking you into custody pending investigation of the bank records. Embezzlement is a serious charge. Donovan's face contorted. For a moment, Thomas thought he might make a run for it, or worse, reach for a weapon. But then something inside the banker seemed to collapse. His shoulders sagged, the fight visibly draining from him. I needed the money, he said, his voice barely audible. After Margaret died, the medical bills, I couldn't cover them. I was going to pay it back. I swear I was going to make it right. You branded a child, Ruth said, her voice hard as iron. Whatever debt you had, you paid it on her skin. And that ain't forgivable. Deputy Wallace stepped forward and took Donovan by the arm. Come on, Gerald. We'll sort this out proper at the jail. As they walked toward the door, Donovan looked back once at Elizabeth. In that brief moment, Thomas saw something unexpected cross the man's face. Not anger or resentment, but something that might have been regret. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily, neither flinching nor offering forgiveness. Then Donovan turned away and allowed himself to be led out into the spring sunshine, a broken man. The crowd began to disperse, folks talking in hushed tones as they drifted toward their wagons and horses. Several nodded to Thomas as they passed, acknowledgement where before there had been avoidance. Ruth came over and put a weathered hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You got your ranch back," she said with a tired smile. "Donovan's bank will be seized by the territory once the fraud is confirmed. Your debt's voided." "How'd you know to look at those ledgers?" Thomas asked. She gave him a wry smile. "I told you before, nobody pays attention to old women, and old women pay attention to everything." She turned to Elizabeth and gave her a gentle pat on the cheek. "You did good today, child. Took real courage to speak up like that." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes drooping with exhaustion now that the confrontation was over. The past weeks had taken their toll. Dr. Franklin approached, medical bag in hand. "Let me check you both over. You look like you've been through the ringer." "We're fine, Doc," Thomas began, but the physician cut him off. Humor an old sawbones who's seen too much suffering to ignore it when it's standing right in front of him. They sat on the church steps while he examined Elizabeth's pulse and breathing. The sun had warmed the air, bringing with it the sweet scent of prairie grass and distant rain. A meadowlark sang from a fence post nearby, its melody carrying across the open land. "You know what happens now?" Franklin asked, closing his bag. Thomas looked at Elizabeth, then out at the open country beyond the town. "We go home," he said simply. "Fix what's broken, plant a garden, live." The doctor smiled. "Sounds like a fine plan." They rode back to the ranch as afternoon light gilded the landscape. The red ribbon still fluttered on the surveyor's stake by the fence line, but it no longer signified loss. It was just a piece of cloth that would soon be gone, like Donovan's hold over them. The cabin stood waiting, solid and unchanged despite all that had happened. When they stepped inside, Elizabeth set the oilskin pouch on the shelf where it had rested since her arrival. She looked at it for a long moment, then turned to Thomas. "Can I call you Pa?" she asked, her voice small but clear. Thomas felt something shift in him, a knot of grief loosening to make room for this new joy. He couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat, so he simply nodded. Elizabeth threw her arms around his waist and held on tight, her face pressed against his chest. He folded his arms around her, marveling at how someone so small could fill such an enormous space in his life. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, their new leaves whispering promises of the seasons to come. Spring had arrived at last. The mud would dry, the grass would green, and they would heal together. Over the next week, news traveled through the county about Gerald Donovan's arrest and the community's decision regarding Elizabeth. Some approved, others thought it improper for a bachelor to raise a young girl, but none challenged the vote. The territorial judge, upon reviewing Dr. Franklin's evidence and the bank records, upheld the community's decision and added his own judgment. Donovan would face trial for embezzlement in Helena. One crisp morning in late May, Ruth Wilson arrived with an unexpected proposal. Thomas was repairing a corral gate when her wagon pulled up, laden with several burlap sacks and wooden crates. "Got something that needs doing," she announced without preamble as she climbed down. "Something important." Elizabeth emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd taken to keeping house with a determination that sometimes brought a pang to Thomas's heart, reminding him of how Catherine had followed Martha around, learning the rhythms of homemaking. "What's that, Miss Ruth?" Elizabeth asked. Ruth reached into her wagon and pulled out a burlap-wrapped object about 2 feet long. "This," she said, "needs to be destroyed." Thomas recognized it immediately from the shape. The branding iron. "The marshal sent it from Helena," Ruth explained. "Evidence is logged and documented now, so they don't need to keep it. I thought," she paused, looking at Elizabeth, "I thought maybe destroying it proper might help put some things to rest." Elizabeth stared at the wrapped iron, her face unreadable. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "I think that would be good." "I was thinking Sunday," Ruth continued, "after service. Reverend Hayes said we could use the church stove. Make it a kind of ceremony." "A ritual of closure," Thomas said, understanding the intent. "Fancy words for burning the thing that hurt you," Ruth replied bluntly. "But yes, that's the idea." That Sunday morning dawned clear and warm, with the kind of soft breeze that promises a perfect day to follow. They rode to town in clean clothes, the wrapped branding irons secured behind the saddle. The church was full for service, and afterward, many of the congregation lingered on the steps, talking and trading news as they always did when good weather arrived after a hard winter. Reverend Hayes met them at the door, his kind eyes taking in the bundle Thomas carried. "Are you ready?" he asked, directing his question to Elizabeth. "Yes, sir," she replied. "I'm ready." Inside, the church smelled of beeswax candles and old wood, sunlight streaming through the windows to paint the floor in warm rectangles of gold. Dr. Franklin was there, and Thomas Smith, the blacksmith, and a handful of others who'd voted for them. Even Deputy Wallace had come, standing quietly at the back, his expression solemn. Thomas unwrapped the iron, revealing it for what it was, cold metal shaped to inflict pain and ownership. The letter D at its end seemed to mock them even now. Elizabeth stood beside him, her hand finding his. Though she'd asked to be the one to put it in the fire, Thomas saw a momentary flicker of fear cross her face as she looked at the brand. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "I can do it." She shook her head, resolve returning to her eyes. "No, it has to be me." The Reverend opened the door of the large cast-iron stove that heated the church in winter. Inside, a fire burned hot and clean, fed with split pine. Elizabeth took the iron from Thomas. To his relief, her hands didn't shake. She approached the stove with slow, deliberate steps, her back straight, then thrust the brand into the heart of the flames. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the metal began to glow, first a dull red, then orange, then white hot. The D at its end softened and warped, its shape distorting until it was unrecognizable, just molten metal in cleansing heat. "May it never mark another soul," Reverend Hayes said quietly. They stood in silence as the iron was consumed by the fire. The only sounds the crack and pop of burning wood and the collective breathing of those gathered. There was something sacred in the moment, a recognition that, while scars remained, the instrument of pain was being transformed. When the iron was reduced to slag, Ruth stepped forward and rang the church bell. Not the urgent peal that had called them to witness against Donovan, but a slow, steady toll that seemed to mark an ending and a beginning all at once. As the last clear note faded, Elizabeth turned to Thomas, her face lighter than he'd ever seen it. "Can we go home now, Pa?" she asked. "Yes," he said, his heart full. "Let's go home." Back at the ranch, Thomas helped Elizabeth plant a garden. She'd never grown anything before, so he showed her how to prepare the soil, how to space the seeds, how to set them at the right depth and cover them gently to give them the best chance. "The Arapaho and Cheyenne call corn, beans, and squash the three sisters," he explained as they worked. "They plant them together because they help each other grow. The corn gives the beans something to climb, the beans fix nitrogen in the soil to feed the corn, and the squash spreads out to keep weeds down and hold moisture in the ground." Elizabeth considered this as she carefully placed bean seeds in the soil. "Like a family," she said, "everyone helping each other in different ways." Thomas nodded, struck by the wisdom in her observation. Just like that. When they reached the edge of the cleared garden space, Elizabeth paused, looking out at the open prairie beyond the fence line. "Can we plant flowers here?" she asked. "Sure, what kind would you like?" She pointed to a spot where the fence met the open grassland. "Right there where you found me that night. I want something beautiful to grow in that spot." Thomas felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. "I think that's a fine idea." They planted wildflower seeds along the fence line, black-eyed Susans, purple coneflowers, and blazing stars that would bloom through summer and into fall, marking the exact place where their paths had crossed in the February snow. They worked until sunset, their hands dirty, their backs tired, but it was good work, the kind that leaves a bone-deep satisfaction. As they washed up for supper, Thomas noticed Elizabeth watching him with a thoughtful expression. "What is it?" he asked. "I was just thinking about planting those seeds," she said. "We won't see the flowers for months, but we believe they'll grow anyway." Thomas nodded, understanding her meaning. "That's faith," he said, "believing in what you can't yet see." She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Like you believing I was worth saving that night." That evening, Ruth came by with a basket of food. Fresh bread, cheese, and dried apples preserved from last fall's harvest. She sat with them by the fire while they ate, and the conversation turned to plans for the future. "First thing is getting those cattle back," Ruth said, nodding toward the east where the Morgan ranch lay. Donovan sold off about 50 head before his arrest, but the rest are still there. Deputy Wallace says they'll be returned to Elizabeth once the legal proceedings are settled. And the land? Thomas asked. That's hers, free and clear, come July when she turns 12. Judge already confirmed it. Elizabeth listened intently, taking in every detail about her inheritance. She'd grown more serious about learning the business of ranching, asking Thomas questions about cattle management and grazing rotation. As the conversation wound down, Ruth looked at Elizabeth with unexpected gentleness. You ever think about forgiving him? She asked. Your uncle, I mean. Elizabeth stared into the fire for a long time before answering. I think about it, she said finally. But I'm not there yet. Maybe someday. Ruth nodded, satisfaction in her eyes. That's honest. Forgiveness ain't something you do because you're supposed to. It's something you do when you're ready, or not at all. Either way is all right. After Ruth departed, Thomas and Elizabeth sat on the porch steps in the gathering dusk. The first stars were appearing, sharp and bright in the deepening blue. A nighthawk called from somewhere in the distance, its distinctive peanting sound carrying across the stillness. The air was rich with the sense of spring, fresh-turned earth, pine resin, and the faint sweetness of wild plum blossoms. Do you miss her? Elizabeth asked suddenly. Catherine, I mean. Every day, Thomas answered honestly. Does it get easier, missing someone? Thomas considered his answer carefully. Not easier, different. He looked up at the emerging stars. You learn to carry it differently. Learn that loving someone doesn't end just because they're gone. It changes shape, becomes part of who you are. She leaned against his shoulder, a gesture of trust that meant more to him than she could know. They sat in companionable silence as darkness settled fully around them, each lost in their own thoughts, but taking comfort in the other's presence. Pa, she said finally. Yes? Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for not letting me give up either. In July, Elizabeth turned 12. They rode into town to file the papers that would make her inheritance official. 300 head of cattle, 200 acres of prime grazing land, and water rights to Cottonwood Creek. The land office clerk, a new man who'd replaced Donovan's associate, processed everything without comment, stamped the documents with the territorial seal, and handed them back. Congratulations, Miss Morgan, he said formally. You are now officially a property owner in Montana Territory. Elizabeth folded the papers carefully and returned them to the oilskin pouch. This time, she didn't clutch it against her chest as if it were her only anchor to reality. She simply tucked it into her saddlebag and smiled at Thomas. Feels different now, she said as they rode home through the summer heat. How so? Before, I thought the paper was all that made me real. Now it's just paper. I'm real whether I have it or not. Thomas nodded, pride swelling in his chest at the wisdom of this child who was rapidly becoming so much more. Their garden had thrived in the summer sun, beans climbing their poles, corn tasseling, squash sprawling across the ground. And true to their hopes, the wildflowers had bloomed in brilliant profusion where the fence met the prairie, exactly where Thomas had found Elizabeth crawling through the snow 5 months earlier. That evening, they had a quiet celebration, a special meal, and afterward, Elizabeth read aloud from McGuffey's Reader by Lamplight, her voice confident now where once it had faltered over unfamiliar words. When she finished, she closed the book and looked at Thomas across the table. What do we do tomorrow? She asked. Same as today, he replied. We live, we work, we take care of each other. Sounds good to me. She smiled then, a full and genuine smile that transformed her face. Thomas realized with a start that he couldn't remember the last time he'd seen her smile like that. Perhaps never. Outside, night settled gently over the land. The horses dozed in the corral. Somewhere in the darkness, the garden grew silently, steadily, and a meadowlark, unusual in its nighttime singing, trilled a brief, sweet melody. They were home. Finally, truly home. 5 years passed, bringing changes both gradual and sudden. Montana Territory, 1875. The cabin had evolved, much like its occupants. Thomas had added a room on the east side where the morning sun hit first, giving Elizabeth a space of her own as she grew into young womanhood. It wasn't fancy, just a bed, a chest for her clothes, and a small window that looked out toward the creek. But it was hers, and that mattered. They'd settled into the rhythms of their shared life. Days spent working their combined lands, evenings spent reading or talking, or sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence as the sun set. Elizabeth had shot up those first 2 years, gaining both height and strength as good food and hard work replaced the deprivation she'd known under Donovan's roof. The brand on her shoulder faded to a silvery scar, visible but no longer angry and raw. She never tried to hide it. "It's part of me now," she told Thomas one summer evening as they sat on the porch. "Like a map showing where I've been, but not where I'm going." Where she was going, it seemed, was everywhere at once. Once Thomas bought her a paint mare with one blue eye, a horse she named Shadow for its uncanny ability to follow her like a devoted dog. Elizabeth ranged far and wide across the combined properties. She learned every creek and gully, every good grazing spot, every landmark on the land her father had loved and left to her. Thomas rode with her sometimes, but more often he gave her the freedom to explore alone. A girl who'd survived what she had wouldn't be troubled by solitude on the open range. And she always returned, usually with some treasure to show him. A hawk's feather, an unusual stone, once even a wolf pup she'd found abandoned by its pack. "We can't keep it," Thomas had said firmly, despite her pleading. "Some wild things need to stay wild." She'd reluctantly returned the pup to where she'd found it, but the lessons stuck with her. Not everything that was broken or lost needed saving. Some things found their own way. The town of Prosperity changed too. The railroad arrived in 1873, bringing new settlers and businesses. A proper schoolhouse was built, and though Elizabeth was older than most students at 16, she attended whenever weather and ranch work allowed, soaking up knowledge with the same intensity she applied to everything. Ruth Wilson still ran the dry goods store, though she spoke increasingly of selling it to move west to Oregon, where her sister had settled. Dr. Franklin, his hair now completely white, took on an apprentice, a serious young man named Michael Harrison, fresh from medical school in St. Louis. Deputy Wallace became Sheriff Wallace after the previous lawman retired. Gerald Donovan served 3 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge for embezzlement, then disappeared from their lives. Rumor had it he'd gone to California to make a fresh start. No one in Prosperity particularly missed him. One crisp October afternoon, Thomas was mending fence on the north boundary, a never-ending task on a working ranch, when he heard hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. His hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt before he recognized the rider. Elizabeth on Shadow, riding hell for leather across the open meadow, her dark hair streaming behind her. She pulled up beside him, breathless and grinning, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Pa, you won't believe who's in town," she announced without preamble. Thomas straightened, rubbing his lower back where it had stiffened from the work. "The president himself?" She laughed, a sound that never failed to warm him. "Better, a horse buyer from the army. They're looking for good stock for the cavalry, offering top dollar." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. The Morgan cattle operation was doing well now. The herd rebuilt after a difficult winter 3 years back that had claimed nearly a third of their stock. But the real money was in horses, especially with the ongoing military campaigns against the Sioux and Cheyenne to the north. "You thinking of selling some of our remuda?" he asked. "Maybe." She dismounted in a fluid motion, coming to stand beside him at the fence. At 16, she was nearly as tall as Thomas, with her father's strong jaw and a confident bearing that spoke of a young woman comfortable in her own skin. "If the price is right, your land, your decision," Thomas reminded her, as he always did when business matters arose. She smiled at that, appreciating his respect for her authority over her inheritance. It had been a point of pride between them from the start. Her land, her choices. He was there to advise, to teach, but never to control. "I'd value your opinion all the same," she said. He considered the horses they'd been breeding, descendants of that wild stallion Elizabeth had first approached in the corral years ago. Armies usually fair in their dealings, and they take good care of their mounts, better than most. He gestured toward the small remuda grazing in the distance. "We've got 5 that might suit, that black gelding for certain." She nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "That's what I was thinking." She glanced at him sideways, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Want to ride in with me tomorrow? Talk to the buyer?" "Sure." He drove another nail into the fence post, securing the wire. "You did good spotting this opportunity." She beamed at the praise, then swung back into the saddle with practiced ease. "I'm going to check the south pasture before dark. Make sure the cattle haven't pushed through that weak section of fence again." "Be home for supper," he called after her retreating figure. She waved without looking back, completely at ease in her world. Thomas watched her go, a familiar bittersweet ache in his chest. She was growing up, finding her path, Someday, perhaps soon, she would ride out and not return, find her own place, perhaps a husband, a family of her own. The thought brought both pride and a twinge of loss. That night, after Elizabeth had gone to bed, Thomas sat on the porch smoking his pipe and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air had turned cool with the promise of frost, autumn giving way to another Montana winter. 5 years since he'd found her in the snow. 5 years of watching her heal, grow, become strong. 5 years of having a reason to get up each morning, of not being alone in the world. He'd thought, when Catherine died, that he was done with family, done with the risk of loving someone who could be taken away in an instant. But life, it seemed, had other plans. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath them. Thomas tapped out his pipe against the porch rail and went inside, grateful for the warmth that awaited him. 5 more years passed, bringing new joys and challenges. Montana Territory, 1880. The wedding took place at the Church in Prosperity on a perfect June day, the kind that seems created specifically for beginnings. Elizabeth wore a dress Ruth had ordered special from Helena, white with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers gathered that morning from the spot where Thomas had found her a decade earlier. The groom was Michael Harrison, Dr. Franklin's former apprentice, and now a physician in his own right. He'd been quietly courting Elizabeth for nearly 2 years, initially so hesitant that Thomas had wondered if the young man would ever work up the courage to speak his mind. But Michael had proven himself steady and thoughtful, with a gentle humor that complemented Elizabeth's more direct nature. Thomas approved of him wholeheartedly. Here was a man who would value Elizabeth for exactly who she was. The church was filled to capacity, the entire community turning out to witness the union of two well-respected young people. Ruth Wilson had returned from Oregon for the occasion, her face creased with travel fatigue but beaming with happiness. Dr. Franklin, now semi-retired and walking with a cane, had asked for the honor of giving the bride away. "You've been her father in every way that matters for 10 years, he'd told Thomas. "But this is my last chance to do something special for her before these old bones give out entirely." Humor an old man's vanity. So Thomas stood to the side during the ceremony, watching with a full heart as Elizabeth, confident, strong, beloved, pledged her life to a good man. The girl he'd found half frozen in the snow had become a woman any father would be proud to call daughter. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the Morgan Ranch, which Elizabeth and Michael would now share. While musicians played and guests danced in the yard, Thomas found a quiet moment with his daughter by the creek that ran along the property's edge. "You happy?" he asked simply. "Yes." Her face glowed with a joy that needed no embellishment. "Very. Your parents would have been proud today. Your mother and father, I mean." She nodded. Elizabeth kept their photographs on her bureau. These parents she barely remembered. Thomas had made certain she knew their stories, that the Morgan legacy remained alive for her. "And Catherine?" she asked softly, mentioning the daughter Thomas had lost. He smiled, feeling not the sharp pain that had once accompanied his daughter's name, but a gentle melancholy mixed with gratitude. "She would have loved having a big sister like you." Elizabeth leaned her head against his shoulder, careful not to disturb her wedding veil. "I'm not going far, just to town." "I know. And you'll visit all the time. Like a bad penny," he promised. She laughed, the sound carrying over the water. "Is that a guarantee?" "Absolute and binding." They rejoined the celebration, where Michael was engaged in an animated discussion with Thomas Smith about the merits of different types of horseshoes for varying terrain. The young doctor looked up when Elizabeth approached, his face transforming with a love so evident it was almost tangible. Thomas stepped back, giving them their moment. Ruth Wilson found him by the refreshment table, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You did good with that girl, Thomas Reeves," she said, her voice husky with emotion. "She did good all on her own," he demurred. Ruth shook her head firmly. "Don't you dare sell yourself short. She needed you, and you were there when it mattered most. Not every man would have been." She squeezed his arm. "Most would have sent her back or packed her off on that orphan train themselves. You stood up, made a difference." Before Thomas could formulate a response, a call went up for dancing to begin. A fiddle started, joined by a harmonica and someone keeping rhythm on a washboard. Chairs were pushed back to create a makeshift dance floor in the yard. Michael led Elizabeth to the center, and they began their first dance as husband and wife. They moved well together, clearly having practiced for this moment. Thomas watched with a complicated joy filling his chest. This was how it should be. Children growing up, finding love, moving forward. The proper order of things, so different from the losses that had marked his earlier years. When the first dance ended, Elizabeth made her way through the crowd to where Thomas stood. "Your turn, Pa," she said, extending her hand. He shook his head. "I don't dance, Elizabeth, you know that." "Today you do," she insisted, her expression brooking no argument. She was immovable, this daughter of his heart. Thomas sighed in mock exasperation and took her hand, allowing her to lead him to the center of the improvised dance floor. "I'll step on your toes," he warned. "I've got sturdy boots under this dress," she assured him with a wink. The music began again, slower this time. Thomas did his best to remember steps he hadn't used since Martha was alive, years of rust falling away as muscle memory returned. Elizabeth guided him subtly, making him appear more graceful than he was. "Thank you," she said as they turned. "For dancing?" he teased. "Don't thank me yet. Still plenty of time for toe-stepping." "No," she said, her expression growing serious. "For everything. For finding me that night. For fighting for me. For teaching me I was worth fighting for." Thomas felt his throat constrict. He couldn't speak for a moment. "That was the easy part," he finally managed. "You were always worth it, Elizabeth. From the first moment." The music ended. She rose on tiptoe to kiss his cheek, then returned to her husband's side. The celebration continued as the summer sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, painting the world in gold. It was a good day, one of the very best. Another 10 years passed, bringing new generations and deeper roots. Montana State, 1890. Thomas sat on the porch of the old cabin, watching his grandson play in the yard. The boy was 6, all knees and elbows and boundless energy, currently engaged in what appeared to be a serious, scientific examination of a grasshopper he'd captured in a jar. "Careful there, Jamie," Thomas called. "Don't shake him too much." The boy looked up and grinned, his father's smile in his mother's face. The Morgan eyes and the Harrison intellect combined in one small package of perpetual motion. "I'm just showing him his new home, Grandpa." "Grasshoppers don't much care for living in jars," Thomas observed mildly. "They prefer the open fields where they can jump to their heart's content." Jamie considered this, looking from the bird to the waving grass beyond the yard. After a moment's deliberation that seemed comically adult on his young face, he unscrewed the lid and watched the insect leap to freedom. "He'll be happier out there," the boy decided. "Wise decision," Thomas agreed. The sound of an approaching wagon caught their attention. Jamie was off like a shot, running down the lane to meet his parents returning from town. Thomas rose more slowly, his joints protesting the movement. At 60, he felt every year, especially on damp days like today when old injuries made themselves known. But he still had his health, his home, and most importantly, his family. That was more than many men his age could claim. The wagon pulled up in front of the cabin. Michael drove, with Elizabeth beside him, their younger child, 4-year-old Catherine, named for the aunt she'd never known, dozing in her mother's lap. Jamie was already clambering up the wheel, peppering his parents with questions about their trip to prosperity. Michael handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper, a present from town, no doubt containing some treasure calculated to delight a 6-year-old boy. Elizabeth passed the sleeping Catherine to her husband and came to Thomas, embracing him warmly. At 32, she was in her prime, strong and capable, respected throughout the county, not just as William Morgan's daughter, but as a successful rancher and community leader in her own right. "How was your day with Jamie?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. "Educational," Thomas replied dryly. "I now know more about grasshoppers, mud puddles, and why the moon appears to follow you when you walk than I ever thought possible." She laughed, the sound still able to warm his heart after all these years. He does ask questions, doesn't he? Gets that from his mother. They went inside the cabin, which had seen numerous improvements over the years. A proper kitchen, glass in all the windows, a second bedroom for when the grandchildren stayed overnight. Yet it remained recognizably the same place where a half-frozen girl had asked if she was real on a bitter February night 20 years before. Thomas had a pot of stew simmering on the stove. It was their routine now. Every Saturday, Elizabeth and Michael brought the children out to the ranch for the day, sometimes staying overnight if weather threatened, or the children pleaded convincingly enough. After supper, when the children were tucked into bed with promises of horse rides in the morning if they went to sleep right away, the adults sat around the fire with cups of coffee, catching up on the week's events. "Sheriff Wallace is retiring," Michael mentioned, "moving to Arizona for his health." "Again?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. He's retired 3 times already by my count. This time he means it, Elizabeth said. Says the winters are getting too hard on his bones. Thomas could sympathize. His own bones weren't what they used to be. Who's taking over the badge? He asked. Jamie Smith, Elizabeth replied. Thomas Smith's son. Thomas nodded approvingly. The blacksmith's boy had grown into a fine man, steady like his father and respected throughout the county. Good choice. He knows everybody. Got a level head on his shoulders. They talked of other matters then. Town news, cattle prices, Elizabeth's plans to expand the horse breeding operation that had become the ranch's most profitable venture. The Morgan Ranch was thriving under her management, now one of the largest spreads in the county. Thomas mostly listened, content to hear their voices, to be included in their lives and plans. When Elizabeth and Michael had first married, he'd harbored a quiet fear that they might drift apart, that his role in Elizabeth's life would diminish. But she wouldn't allow it. She made certain he remained part of everything, consulted him on decisions, brought the children to know and love him, kept him at the center of the family she was building. As the fire burned down to coals, Michael excused himself to check on the children, leaving Thomas and Elizabeth alone. You're quiet tonight, Pa, she observed. He shrugged. Just thinking. About what? Time. How fast it goes. He gestured vaguely. Seems like yesterday you were Jamie's age, sounding out words in that old McGuffey's reader. She studied his face in the firelight, her expression softening. Regrets? She asked quietly. Thomas shook his head without hesitation. Not a one. Not even about staying single all these years? Ruth always said you should have remarried, found someone to share your life with. Ruth had opinions about everything, Thomas said with a wry smile. Besides, I wasn't alone. I had you. Elizabeth reached across and took his hand. Yes, you did. Still do. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the pop and hiss of the dying fire, the distant murmur of wind in the cottonwoods. I saw a girl in town today, Elizabeth said after a time, her voice carefully neutral. Maybe 13, skinny as a rail, selling matches outside the mercantile. Said she had no people. Thomas looked at her, understanding immediately where this was going. What did you do? Bought all her matches, then took her to the hotel, got her a hot meal, a bath, some clean clothes. And then I brought her home with us. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. She's sleeping in our spare room tonight. Thomas nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face. What's her name? Sarah. Sarah Jenkins. She came west on the orphan train 3 years ago, was placed with a family near Bozeman. They worked her hard, treated her like a servant. She ran away last month, been making her way town to town since then. What does Michael think about this development? He's the one who suggested bringing her home, Elizabeth said, her voice warm with pride in her husband. Said no child should be alone if we have room at our table. He's a good man, your doctor. Yes, he is. Thomas looked into the fire, watching the play of light and shadow. 20 years ago, he'd made a choice that changed the course of his life. Now Elizabeth was making the same choice, extending the circle wider. The wheel turns, he said softly. She squeezed his hand. Sarah reminds me of me, scared but trying not to show it, expecting the worst from everyone. What are you going to do? Whatever she needs. Food, shelter, schooling, a family if she wants one. She looked at him, her eyes bright in the firelight. I learned from the best. Thomas felt a tightness in his throat. He'd never thought of himself as anyone's example, just a man doing what needed doing. But here was the proof that it had mattered, that the ripples of one act of kindness could spread across decades. Bring her out here tomorrow, he said. Let her meet Jamie and Catherine. See the horses. Elizabeth nodded. I will. Outside, an owl called, its voice carrying clear through the night. A familiar sound, comforting in its constancy. The seasons turned, children grew, old wounds healed. Life went on, a great wheel always in motion. Thomas Reeves sat by the fire with his daughter's hand in his, knowing with bone-deep certainty that whatever came next would be faced with the same courage and compassion that had seen them through 20 years together. That was legacy enough for any man. 10 more years passed, bringing both sorrow and new beginnings. Montana, 1900. The old man rocked gently on the porch of the weathered cabin, his story finished. His grandson sat at his feet, eyes wide with wonder, in the special kind of attention children reserve for tales they've heard before but never tire of. So that's how you found her, the boy said. My grandmother. Thomas nodded, his weathered hands resting on the arms of the rocking chair that had been his companion for 3 decades now. That's how. And she saved you just like you saved her. She did it that. Thomas smiled at the boy's perception. People often think saving is only one direction, but the truth is we save each other. The boy pondered this for a moment, his young face serious with thought. And then she saved Sarah, who became Aunt Sarah. That's right. And Sarah grew up to be a teacher, helping lots of children who needed someone to believe in them. And one of those children was Mercy Williams, who saved those people from the fire in Helena. Thomas smiled. His grandson had heard these connections many times, knew the chain of kindness by heart. Mercy might have done that anyway, he said. But yes, that's how I choose to see it. One act leading to another, on and on through the years. The boy stood up, brushing dust from his pants. At 10, he had his grandmother's determined eyes and stubborn chin. Elizabeth's blood ran strong in him, though she'd been gone 5 years now, taken by the influenza that had swept through Montana in '95, claiming many lives, including his beloved daughter. That had been the darkest time since Catherine's death, a loss that threatened to pull Thomas back into the solitary grief he had known before. But Elizabeth had built something stronger than death, a family that held together through the worst storms. Michael had needed him, the children had needed him, and Sarah's 3 children had needed their Grandpa Thomas too. So he had remained, finding his way through grief again, this time not alone. I'm going to do something important too, the boy announced, breaking into Thomas's reverie. Something that helps people. I believe you will, Thomas said, meaning it. Just remember, most important things don't look important when you're doing them. They're just what needs doing at the time. The boy considered this bit of wisdom, then nodded, accepting it. He turned at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. That's Pa! He said we go fishing if I finish my chores. And he was off, running down the lane to meet the rider. Michael, still practicing medicine at 55, though his hair had silvered at the temples. Thomas watched them go, smiling at his grandson's boundless energy. Youth was wasted on the young, they said. But perhaps it wasn't wasted at all. Perhaps it was just being properly invested, stored up for the long journey ahead. He looked toward the edge of the property, where wildflowers still bloomed each spring at the spot where he'd found Elizabeth 30 years ago. She'd made him promise to keep planting them, even after she was gone. So something beautiful grows here, she'd said from her sickbed during that terrible winter, echoing her words from that first planting decades before. And something did. Flowers, children, hope, a legacy that would outlive them all. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the late afternoon sun warm on his face. 70 years old now, with more days behind him than ahead. But good days they'd been, especially these last 30. He told the boy the story again because stories matter. They connect us, teach us, remind us that we're part of something larger than ourselves. A chain of moments and choices stretching backward and forward through time. In the distance, he could hear his grandson's excited voice as he greeted his father. Another link in the chain, another chapter in the story. Thomas Reeves, once a lonely man with nothing to lose, now the patriarch of a family spanning 3 generations. All because on a bitter winter night long ago, he'd heard a sound that didn't belong and gone to investigate. The smallest choices make the longest echoes. He opened his eyes and watched Michael and his son heading toward the creek, fishing poles in hand, their voices carrying back to him on the breeze. They waved and he waved back, his heart full despite its scars. Home. Finally, truly home.